Record. Okay. I think we're live now. Thanks everyone for joining. Walks Conservation Cafeteria is our opportunity to tell you about some of our pressing conservation issues that we are working on. I'm Alec Underwood, our program director. Happy to see so many folks on the call today, including current staff. I see former staff, board members and former board members and everyone else. So just really appreciate everyone joining in here. Today we are going to talk about our opportunity to conserve our quality landscapes in the Northern Red Desert through the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan. For those of you who know, the plan has been somewhat controversial with folks and industry groups kind of raising their concerns about what the plan might do on the ground. I myself just had the privilege of serving on the governor's task force. We were appointed to represent conservation interests at the table. I'll be honest in saying that this was a really challenging process for conservation interests because of a lot of misinformation out there about what this plan would do. For those of you who know us well, a lot of what the BLM's preferred alternative would do is protect some of those landscapes that we all care about. Sites like Boar's Tusk and Cedar Canyons, Oregon Buttes, and some of the best remaining wildlife habitat left in the lower 48 for species like sage grouse and some of our big game migrations. So Megan Riley, who is our wildlife program manager, is going to be presenting today on some of those wildlife values. It's a really exciting presentation. I think for good of the order and allowing Megan to get her points across here, we're going to drop questions in the chat function. Should be at the bottom bar of your Zoom. So folks who have questions, please drop it there. Another note on the back to the task force, sorry, that I forgot to mention, is that yesterday the group finalized our recommendations to go both to the governor and to the Bureau of Land Management, and we'll be dropping in the link to the website in which you can find those recommendations. And so again, we'll hold questions to the end, but a really exciting presentation from Megan here today. And Megan, I will, without further ado, kick it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Alec. And thanks everyone for being here. I have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to start sharing my screen and then you can look at some cool pictures instead of just my face while I'm talking to you. All right. So as Alec mentioned, we are here today to talk a little bit about the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan that we've all heard a lot about in the news, and I'm happy that you're here. Before we get into the Rock Springs plan in particular, I wanted to talk about just what a resource management plan is in general to give us all some background. So it's just a blueprint for how a BLM field office manages resources and uses. And that includes cultural and historic sites, water, plant communities, fish and wildlife, recreation, grazing, minerals and energy development, basically all of those multiple uses that the BLM is mandated with managing for. Field offices get their guidance from these resource management plan on how to manage for them. And it can be decades between the time when these plans are revised, which is why it's so important to take advantage and comment and provide input when the revision process is going on, because these plans can last for a really long time. All right, so within the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan, there are 4 different alternatives. There's alternative A, which is no action. Management would just continue as it has for the last couple decades unchanged. There's alternative B, which is a conservation focused plan, and that's what the agency has indicated is their preferred plan in this instance. There's alternative C, which is more focused on industry and development. And then there's alternative D, which is sort of a blending of conservation and development, although it's not a 50-50 split, depending on which part of the plan you're talking about. It might trend one way or the other between those two poles. But basically, for each action or designation that's proposed in this resource management plan, there are these 4 alternatives. But the agency doesn't have to pick just one alternative for the whole resource management plan. For each action within the plan, they can pick and choose between these 4 alternatives. And that's important in your comments, sort of focusing on which part of the plan you're talking about and which of these alternatives you prefer. I think in many instances, the alternative B plan is really positive for conservation. So it's often a good choice for many of the management actions. All right, so getting back to the RMP process, this falls under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which requires meaningful public participation, which is how we get our power and say over how this plan turns out. And under NEPA, they have to go through scoping, present a draft EIS, which is where we are now, the draft resource management plan. There's a final EIS, a protest period, and then a record of decision. So the places where a public has the opportunity to comment and provide input were during scoping, which happened a while ago, right now during this draft RMP, which is out for public comment, and then one last time during the protest period. But the part of this process where public can have the most influence is probably right now during this draft RMP being out for public comment. This is when the agencies presented some ideas and they really want feedback about which direction to go. So it's really important to weigh in now during this public comment period. All right, so that's the process. Now let's orient ourselves to the Rock Springs field office. I think many of you are familiar with it, but this is a map of the Rock Springs field office, and in the very bottom right of your screen, you should be able to orient yourself within the state of Wyoming where it is. It's in the southwestern portion of the state. And this resource management plan for this field office was last updated in 1997, which is almost 30 years ago. A lot has changed in the world and in Wyoming over that time, so it's understandable that an update is ongoing right now. The BLM began this revision process over 10 years ago, and it's going to determine management for 3.6 million acres. So it's pretty significant. And of course, this area is highly significant for people in Wyoming, and I would also say across the nation. And to get into that, I'm going to talk a little bit about some ecology and why this area is so significant. So here we have a map of the sagebrush biome in the western US. And what you're looking at in green here is the historic extent of that sagebrush biome. This is the current extent of sagebrush in the western US. You can see that there's a lot less than there used to be. It's estimated that we're currently losing 1.3 million acres of sagebrush habitat every year. That said, Wyoming is something of a bright spot. You can see that we have basically the best of what's left, the largest, most intact stretches of sagebrush habitat anywhere in the country and actually anywhere in the world. And this sagebrush habitat covers a pretty good chunk of the Rock Springs field office. So this is the general area of the field office, and you can see that navy blue, that really dark blue, is core sagebrush area. So you can see that there's a lot of good sagebrush habitat in the vicinity of the Rock Springs field office, especially in this northern portion of the field office. And as Alec mentioned, my area of expertise is wildlife, so I will focus a lot on that when I'm talking about the values in this field office. The sagebrush steppe supports 350 different species, and just within the Rock Springs field office, there's so much sagebrush, you can expect there's a lot of species that are reliant on that sagebrush within this field office. The Rock Springs field office also has these really cool vernal pools that support aquatic species out in the Kilpecker sand dunes. Snow accumulates there, and then in late spring, early summer, it melts, and you can find shrimp and frogs out in these vernal pools. The field office also has great habitat for raptors, species like golden eagles and ferruginous hawks that need a lot of open space, do really well here. Rock Springs Field Office also has a somewhat famous herd of desert elk. If you're a hunter, it's a pretty prized tag. And yeah, they're just really kind of well-known herd of elk that don't rely on feed grounds or anything that live in this field office. And there's also a couple of really famous long distance migrations that many of you have probably heard of that occur partially within the Rock Springs Field Office. There's the Red Desert to Hoback or Sublet Mule Deer Migration Corridor, which is actually the longest mule deer migration corridor that's ever been documented anywhere in the world. So it's pretty significant. And the Sublet Pronghorn Migration Corridor also kind of gets its toe into this field office, and a lot of the Sublet pronghorn herd winters in this field office, and these animals do a really remarkable migration from Rock Springs Field Office, the northern portion of the field office, all the way up to the Upper Hoback, and a couple of these animals in this herd get all the way to Grand Teton National Park. And again, as I've been sort of hammering on all the great sagebrush habitat in this field office, I did want to note the fact that there are sagebrush obligate species that only occur in sagebrush habitat. They rely on it for food or shelter for part or all of their life cycle. These are species like the greater sage grouse, sage sparrows, brewer sparrows, sage thrashers, pronghorn, pygmy rabbits, sagebrush voles. There's a bunch of animals that really rely on the sagebrush biome to make their living. And I was going to talk a little bit about greater sage grouse because it's such a significant species that a lot of attention is placed on. So again, we're going to look at some maps looking at past and current extents. Greater sage grouse have experienced range-wide declines in recent decades. On this map, you can see the light green represents where greater sage grouse used to live. And in dark green, you can see where they occur relatively recently today. And again, Wyoming is a stronghold for this species, which, given this is a sagebrush obligate species, we would expect that if we have some of the best remaining sagebrush habitat, it's going to stand to reason that Wyoming has some of the best remaining sage grouse populations anywhere. And within the Rock Springs Field Office, if you look up to the northern section there in the big sandy foothills, there's the so-called Golden Triangle. And this area has some of the greatest densities of sage grouse anywhere on the planet, and just amazing congregations of males showing up at the leks in the spring. Now, the BLM is actually not addressing sage grouse management in this resource management plan for Rock Springs. They're doing a whole separate sage grouse management plan, which I will be tracking and will be coming out in the next few months. You'll probably be hearing from me about it. But even though the Rock Springs resource management plan isn't addressing sage grouse directly, there are parts of this draft RMP that would affect the species. So if you care about sage grouse, there are parts of this plan that are really relevant to their conservation. All right, so we can dive in a little bit to some of the wildlife provisions that sort of stand out in this draft RMP for Rock Springs. There are several provisions that matter a lot for big game habitat protections, specifically migration corridors, winter range, and parturition areas. And I have the number for the management action that is really important. I won't go into too much detail, but just in your comments, there's specific management actions that relate to these values and resources. So I just have them in there for your information, but I'll talk more about the values. Basically, migration corridors, winter range, parturition areas, these are all seasonally important habitats that big game species are really reliant on to do well. And they can be especially vulnerable during these times of the year like winter or during parturition. And so that's why it's important that we have good protections in place for these animals in that seasonally important habitat. And under alternative B, there would actually be some pretty strong protections to guide what kind of development can take place within migration corridors or winter range or parturition areas. Similarly, for raptors, nest sites and associated feeding areas can be really important to nest success and how these animals are doing in the Rock Springs Field Office. So management action 4431 would deal with, again, what kind of development can take place near these areas in the time of year when raptors are nesting. There's also fishery protections in the plan that would protect spawning and incubation and fry areas in fish producing streams in the field office. I myself am not a fish person, but for those of you who care a lot about fish, like this is a part of the plan that might be relevant to you. And also I wanted to note areas of critical environmental concern. Now, for those of you who haven't heard this term before, it's just a special designation that the BLM uses, and they can identify within a field office a certain geography that has values that are sort of exceptional that they want to manage for. And in the case of this RMP we're looking at right now, there are a few ACEC designations that have been proposed that are really meaningful for wildlife. For instance, there are 2 ACEC designations that have been put forward in that golden triangle where there's the really great sage grouse habitat. That's big sandy openings. Sorry, let me get my notes here. Oh, and the Southwind River ACEC. And you can see the numbers in the plan associated with those 2 ACECs. But basically, if those ACECs got designated, it would be really positive for sage grouse. There's also the Big Game Migration Corridor ACEC, and that would designate that whole sublet mule deer, red desert to hoback migration corridor as an area of critical environmental concern, and just make sure that the BLM is managing it to protect that connectivity for mule deer, given that it is a really significant corridor because it's the longest in the world for that species. All right, now, again, my area of expertise is wildlife, but I did want to touch on a few other values that we care about in this field office, and especially in the northern part of the field office, there's a lot of cultural sites of significance. For instance, there are a lot of rock art sites in the Rock Springs field office, and under alternative B, there could be more protective management of these sites, greater buffer areas around rock art sites to make sure that the view shed is protected and that development doesn't happen too close to these areas. And again, talking about ACECs, there are 2 existing ACECs for rock art sites in this field office, Cedar Canyon and White Mountain petroglyphs. And if any of you have been out there, you know that these are really phenomenal places. And under a couple of alternatives in this resource management plan, those ACECs would disappear and not be managed as areas of critical environmental concern anymore. So if you care about those areas being sort of held up as really significant and protected for those rock art sites, you could look at these special designation numbers and propose that they follow the alternative B and retain those sites. There's also in the plan some provisions around areas of high cultural resource density. There's a few places that would, under alternative B, be managed as historic districts, and that just gives them extra protection and an extra focus on that cultural resource value. And finally, we talked about a couple of areas of critical environmental concern for those rock art sites, but there's also the boar's tusk, which is both culturally very significant and geologically significant. And under alternative B, there's a couple provisions in the plan that would just put extra emphasis on keeping that area protected for future generations. All right, so the plan also has some sort of trends where the agency is looking at changing where development can occur in the field office. And in general, what we're seeing is the BLM is looking to kind of have more closures and withdrawals and exclusions from development in that northern red desert part of the field office where there's high wildlife habitat value, a lot of amazing cultural and historic resources, and really great open landscapes and recreational opportunities. So this would be a shift from the status quo. Currently, most of the field office is open, and at least under alternative B, more of the field office might be closed. And that would be to mineral extraction, such as oil and gas, coal, renewable energy. and rights of way. And rights of way are just infrastructure associated with development. And to give you an idea of this, there's lots of maps involved, but just as an example, this map shows what's proposed under Alternative B for fluid mineral leasing or oil and gas. And red is what is proposed for closure under Alternative B. And you can see a lot of the closures are focused up in the northern part of the field office and also down south in the greater Little Mountain area. And it's actually, in addition to the wildlife and cultural and recreation values that would be protected with these closures, if you look at this map that I've just thrown up here, it shows potential for mineral development in the field office, and the lighter yellow shows areas of low potential for oil and gas. So you can see, even though there's a proposal for a lot of closures, it's actually in areas where there's not a whole lot of potential for oil and gas anyway. So that's a little bit about where development could occur and where the agency might be leaning in this resource management plan. As far as wide open spaces, I know that's something that I love about Wyoming and this field office in particular. And again, the agency with Alternative B seems to be focusing on maintaining wide open spaces in the northern red desert. And more acres under Alternative B would be managed for visual resource management, view shed protection, areas of critical environmental concern, and lands with wilderness characteristics. Also, for those of you who know about wilderness study areas, those are addressed in this plan. I mean, wilderness study areas were put in place by Congress decades ago, and currently they're being managed as wilderness until Congress makes an ultimate decision about whether they should be wilderness or not. But in the meantime, they're being managed as wilderness, and there are a few of these in the Rock Springs field office. But if Congress decides at some point that these wilderness study areas shouldn't be wilderness and sort of take them off the books, under Alternative B of this resource management plan, there is direction for the BLM to continue managing these WSAs for wilderness values. And that's under special designation 7101. So if you're a person who really loves specific wilderness study areas within the field office, that would be a provision that you might want to comment on. All right, so I've barely scratched the surface, and I threw out a lot of management actions and special designations. So if you want to learn more, do more research, you can find this resource management plan yourself and do some diving in deeper. You can Google Rock Springs resource management plan, and it should pop up at the very top of the search engine. But you can also go to this website, and it brings you to e-planning and the page for this management plan. Then you would just click on documents. And after you do that, it takes you to this page. And if you click on volume 1 Rock Springs, you can download the whole first volume of this draft resource management plan and go up to the search tab and put in whatever search terms you're most interested in, like big game or recreation or anything that matters to you. You can try to comb through this whole document. I will say it's over 600 pages long, and there actually is a volume 2 as well. So if you want a tour guide or you want to ask a specific question about what I've presented on or what's in the plan, please feel free to call me, email me. I'm happy to be your tour guide through this massive document. All right, so I'm hoping that you will all be willing to provide comment to the BLM on how you want to see this part of Wyoming managed in the future. And the way that you can comment is, in your comments, be brief, be specific, and be polite. And also focus on what matters to you. This is a massive plan, and there's no way any one person can comment meaningfully on the whole thing. So just think about what matters most to you in this part of Wyoming. And then share your personal connection to the land's resources and uses of interest to you in your comments. And if you can describe how proposed management actions would affect you, that's really helpful to the agency. And also, if you can specify which alternatives management actions most align with what you'd like to see in the Rock Springs field office, that's also really helpful. And the places to comment are, you can either go direct to e-planning, to BLM's comment portal and drop a comment in there, Or we at Outdoor Council also have a landing page where you can submit a comment and it goes direct to e-planning, but we also have a bunch of background information and talking points if you need a little bit more guidance as you're crafting your comments. Or you can also write to the Rock Springs field office and send something via snail mail. But the deadline to comment is January 17th, which is next Wednesday, which doesn't give a lot of time. So if you comment online, that gives you a little bit more breathing room. And yeah, that's sort of the end of my presentation, and I will pass it back to Alec.
Thank you, Megan. Wonderful presentation as always. And just so folks know, those couple of links that Megan mentioned at the end of her presentation are now in the chat. Everyone should be able to see that. Really quick, we have a couple questions in the chat already. And again, I'd encourage other folks to either use the raise your hand function or drop your question directly in the chat. But first one was from Juan about what are the more common misinformation topics and how they can be countered. Juan, I'll take that one. The largest source of misinformation was in regard to some inclusions in the draft RMP that were about travel management planning, which is typically a completely different process from the RMP. A lot of folks thought that the ACECs and special designations would be limiting to human use. Even on oil and gas stipulations, such as no surface occupancy, the public has been confused about, instead of meaning surface development, people thought that meant that no human presence. And so none of that could be further from the truth. And so the BLM has actually clarified multiple times now that anything in this plan is not actually going to affect where people can use the landscape currently. And even on the task force, it was that misinformation really held up the process at times. So Juan, I hope that answered your question about the source of misinformation. It was mostly about designated routes and roads, which are not included in this RMP. Tom Christensen, thanks for the question here. Were the tribes part of the state process? As far as we understand, the tribes were contacted by the governor's office ahead of the task force and I think declined to participate, probably to protect their sovereignty. And I think that it was a really tricky process. I mean, in our eyes, certainly a missing voice from the task force, but we certainly understand why they might not want to be part of the governor's appointed task force. So the task force itself, for your second part of your question, rock art, there were certain consensus recommendations that came out in support of some of the existing ACECs, such as Boar's Tusk section of the Sand Dunes ACEC, Cedar Canyon, and White Mountain petroglyphs. I believe all three of those garnered support to retain those ACECs in the recommendations. So I will open it up now to other questions about either Megan's presentation or the governor's task force. And again, you can use your raise the hand function down in your Zoom, or post your question directly in the chat. We'll give folks 1 minute here. Does anyone have any questions? Well, again, folks, I think Megan made a good point. This is a huge document, and it does dictate the management of all of these lands and some landscapes that we really care about for the next 20, maybe plus years. Dan, you said you had a question here. So again, I'm encouraging everyone to go comment either through the e-planning link that's in the chat or Wyoming Outdoor Council's action page. Dan, if you want to unmute and go ahead with your question.
Yeah, sorry, it took me a minute to get to the right spot there. I haven't used this app in a while. I live on the Upper Hoback and been paying attention to the Sublette County commissioners meetings, and it seems like that on this may be a little bit off topic, but it's on the path for the pronghorn. It seems like that the Sublette County commissioners are deferring to the Wyoming County Commissioners Association for comments on the path, which would be coming from the Red Desert to the Hoback area. Have you guys seen that comment from the Wyoming County Commissioners Association?
Megan, did you want to field that question?
So Dan, were you talking in reference to this resource management plan or just about the county commissioner's reaction to path of the pronghorn potentially getting identified and designated by the state?
Yes, the comments were due January 5th on the path. The Sublette County Commissioners deferred and did not make a public statement at any meeting, but they were going to attach their comments or their approval, whatever the Wyoming County Commissioners Association was going to do. I don't know what it is. It didn't, the wink and the nod sounded like it wasn't going to be good.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think we might not hear more until the March Game and Fish Commission meeting in Pinedale, when the department, Game and Fish, is going to present to the commissioners about the public comments that they received. It's possible that we might hear a little bit about what kind of comments they received, or maybe a commissioner or the Commissioners Association might attend that meeting when the commissioners are deciding whether or not to move forward with the designation process or not. What I've heard is that certainly there were some county commissioners that were skeptical or hesitant about this migration corridor designation process moving forward, but as to which county commissioners from which counties, I don't have that information, unfortunately, but I'm very curious as well.
Well, I mean, I can tell you which way it's going to roll with those three, with three of the votes. From what I hear, that we'll find that White, Bradley, and Noble are all opposed to the path. I just thought it was, I don't know, disingenuous that they weren't coming out publicly with their position and throwing it on the backs of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. But and this still may be off topic also, but the Sublette County is working on their planning and zoning regulations. I know that you guys deal strictly with federal properties and BLM properties, but it's going to have I think a dramatic impact on the migration route and development in Sublette County. So keep your eyes open for that in the coming few months.
Yes, definitely what happens on county and private lands is hugely important.
Yeah, they're looking to create a agricultural planned unit development clause in the planning and zoning regulations, would then open up to cluster homes, leaving space open, but it's likely to invite development because a lot of people don't want 35 acres or 40 acres that it stipulates right now. So they'd start carving up large agricultural properties and putting cluster developments in throughout the county.
Dan, thank you for flagging that for us. Really appreciate it. Tom, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so glancing at the report earlier this morning, it talked about the items that for which consensus could not be reached that weren't addressed, and it encouraged all the individual parties to reach out to their members and so forth and have them comment. So are we going to hear some specific recommendations from you here today on topics that we should really be that are important that we should be making some comments on?
Sure, Tom. Yeah, and for folks who do go to our comment portal on Rock Springs RMP, again, link is in the chat there. Those do have some high-level talking points about broadly why we support some of the fluid mineral leasing closures, as well as things like rights of way exclusion in some of those areas. But really, as Megan pointed out in her presentation, a lot of that country that's up in the northern part of the Rock Springs field office is what we're really focused on. Big sandy foothills encompassing the Golden Triangle, other areas of the northern Red Desert, which is on the other side of Highway 28. Those are really the areas we care about, and it's hard to Tom, point out exact recommendations given how many elements are in this plan and different management prescriptions. But broadly speaking for those landscapes as some of the areas that were untouched by the task force. And by that, I mean, we failed to garner support from certain interest groups on supporting what alternative B is proposing in those areas. And so that's really what we're looking forward to, is seeing some additional restrictions on oil and gas leasing and rights of way, and to protect that landscape's integrity up there. Did that answer your question, Tom?
Yes, thanks.
Let's see here. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Max, go ahead.
I just had a quick question about what happens next. Like this, Megan pulled up the slide about what the periods are, but I'm just like, I wonder timeline, like what do you expect, you know, how long will this take for them to come back with their final plan? And then how long is that period of protest? Like what happens next?
That's a great question, Max. And I don't know if I have an exact answer. I have worked in other RMP planning processes before, but you know, typically after this comment period closes, the agency is then considering the thousands upon thousands of comments that they've gotten and how they can adjust the final plan. And so I think we fully expect that the BLM is trying to do what they call a record of decision, which is to finalize the plan. And that would be probably before the end of the year, I would say. And so I'm sure it'll be a couple months here of them analyzing public comment. Megan, I don't know if you know off the top of your head how many comments currently, but I'm sure it's probably approaching like 20,000 or something in that range. So yeah, it's a lot for the agency, and I think that it'll be a few months for sure before they come up with the final plan.
Thanks.
Other questions from folks? All righty, I don't, unless someone has one more question here. I don't see any. Oh, Chris, go ahead. You, I think you're on mute, Chris.
Sorry. Hi, Alex. Since you were on the task force, I was wondering what representatives from other groups were the most amenable to conservation? Because I'm assuming oil and gas is just completely against it. But is there anybody we can, as members of the public, reach out to and support their support of conservation?
Yeah, that's a good question, Chris. I mean, I would say the group that was most closely aligned with our priorities to protect wildlife was some of the sporting interests. So Muley Fanatic Foundation, Josh Corsi, and Wyoming Wildlife Federation Executive Director Joy Bannon. They were both very involved in this task force, and we did find alignment with those two groups some of the time. And in addition to that, I think from my perspective, from the very start, we had all these interest groups trying to figure out how to work together and how to address everyone's concerns. And so in the beginning, it was hard to build trust with each other as we were trying to figure out our different priorities. But I'd say by the end of the task force, we were working collaboratively with other groups. And I would say even groups who we wouldn't assume would be aligned with our conservation interest found some ways to support conservation in the plan. Did we develop recommendations on the landscapes we really care about? No, we couldn't get there. And I think that that was primarily due to some of the hardline interest groups who just couldn't go there. But in many similar ways, we were the last line of defense for fish and wildlife habitat on several votes that came up. So we found alignment with all groups at times, but I would say the sporting groups primarily, that shared interest in wildlife was a good one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. A question in the chat here from William. Do you think the pending presidential election would slow the process? Absolutely. Yep. I think the agency has been clear, though, that they are trying to finalize this RMP soon. And I think whether or not that's related to the election, I think the point is it's a long process that this RMP has gone through. I think it started initially back around 2010 or 2011. So I think the goal of the agency is to wrap up this final RMP sometime in the next 6 to 8 months. And Tom, thank you for your comment there about the BLM sage grouse plan. That's another one that's coming. So, other questions? All righty. Well, seeing none,
Wait,
oh,
wait.
good. Add one more.
Since we have a few minutes, Megan, could you put your list of how to comment back up on the screen?
Yes, absolutely, Kathy. And just so everyone knows, we're also going to be sending out an email to all the members, and it'll have a link to this whole presentation that we've recorded and some other materials that people can use, including the slide deck that'll have all these slides. But I will put that slide up for you right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. So you can folks see that on their screens. We'll give everybody a minute here. If there's no final questions, I just wanted to wrap up by thanking Megan for the excellent presentation and everyone who joined today. We really depend on everybody who cares about these issues to tune in and take action. And again, it's next Wednesday is the deadline for comments, and we would really encourage all of you to either go to the BLM's e-planning page or our comment form. Make sure to add your personal take in there as well, and really depend on your voices to advocate for these places. So I just appreciate everyone being here today and tuning in. And if I could put in one final plug, we have these conservation cafeterias on a wide array of issues. On the 22nd, Monday the 22nd at noon is another one in which we'll be partnering up with Powder River Basin Resource Council to talk about a preview of our legislative work. And so folks can we'll be sending out information on that, and would encourage you to tune in as well. So thanks everyone for joining today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.